Good morning and welcome to Sunday Agenda. I'm Helen Daly. It's been a week where Prime Minister Rudd strode the world stage, first at the UN in New York and then at the G20 summit in Pittsburgh. Mr Rudd declared historic achievements for Australia, especially with the G20 taking over from the G8 as the world's peak economic decision-making body. We're looking at those outcomes from two points of view, talking with Acting Opposition Leader Julie Bishop and later Finance Professor Fariborz Moshirian from the University of New South Wales. First, though, here's a little of what the Prime Minister had to say.
This is an historic day for Australia because for the first time ever, Australia has secured a permanent place at the top table of global economic decision-making. Today is also an important day for the world as we bring into being a new global body, the G20, to help deal with the global economic problems of the present and of the future.
Prime Minister Rudd at the conclusion of the G20 summit in Pittsburgh. Now, it pledged tougher financial controls, including on executive salaries, and it ruled that stimulus packages should stay in place till there are signs of durable recovery. Well, how does that all square with Australian interests? I'm joined in the studio by Acting Opposition Leader Julie Bishop. Thanks for coming in.
Good morning, Helen.
Now, do you support the government's work pushing very much for Australia to have a seat at the table at the G20, and now the G20 is going to be the peak decision-making body for global issues?
I think it was inevitable that the G20 would have a greater role to play in global financial affairs. It was established a decade ago in the wake of the Asian financial crisis. Peter Costello, on behalf of Australia at that time, was instrumental in the setting up of the G20. It was the successor to the G22, the G33, so there have been groupings in the past, but it's important that this is to replace the G8 in terms of a focus on global financial matters. I think that was inevitable. It is a good thing that Australia has a place at the table.
So you support the work Kevin Rudd's done this week in particular?
I believe that it was important for Australia to be obviously part of these meetings in the United States, and it was inevitable that the G20, a much broader representation of developed and developing countries, would occur. And so, yes, we support the G20 being at the centre of global affairs in that regard.
Now, much of the commentary this week has actually given a big tick to the Rudd government. Would you support that? Do you think it is a big win for the government?
Well, we've got to put it in context. The G20 is about global matters. We must ensure that we act in Australia's best interests. And so it's all very well to have global aspirations on how certain economies should recover, the global economy, but we should focus on what is best for the Australian economy.
But do you think even getting Australia a seat at the table, and now this table is the preeminent sort of economic decision-making body, that is a big win for the government?
Well, what we have to be careful about, Helen, is that we just don't adopt whatever the G20 determines is right for the global economy. We must ensure that our responses are tailor-made for the Australian economy. You see, our economy is in a vastly different position to virtually every other comparable economy. We went into the global financial crisis in better shape. Our banks were well capitalised, better regulated. We didn't have any banking failures in this country, and that is in stark contrast to many others. We had no government debt. I mean, Peter Costello was paying off government debt as other countries were racking up debt. So our economy is vastly different. Our responses should also be different. But of course, we respect the G20 and the global aspirations.
Do you think, in fact, that's going to be a big problem with the G20, that everyone will say, well, we have to protect our own national interests, and in the end, those national interests might sort of supersede the global interest?
But at the end of the day, each leader does look after their national interest. The G20 is about global aspirations on financial matters. It's focusing on the global financial sector, not anything further at this point, although I know there's discussion about that, having a broader mission. But what you must do is look at those global aspirations, but still tailor it to suit your country's economy. And it would be irresponsible for a country to do otherwise.
You've just said that you're supportive of the G20 and you think it's a very good move. But, I mean, this week you accused the PM of an obsession with chasing the global limelight. Do you think that was being too parochial?
No, not at all. I was talking about the fact that the Prime Minister was saying, you know, he's having breakfast with Bill Clinton and getting this kind of coverage. I mean, it was just... But
isn't it all pushing Australia's interests, and now we have this G20 outcome which you approve of?
No, look, well, there are certain aspects of the Prime Minister's chasing of the global limelight that I don't think is in Australia's national interest. For example, a seat on the Security Council. At what price is Australia going to get a seat on the Security Council, according to Mr Rudd? So that's an area where I believe that he is pursuing an aim without any real benefit for Australia, and it will also cost us, not only in terms of the actual dollars, but also these hidden costs in aid money that the government is now directing to countries whose vote they are chasing for a seat on the Security Council, and also the compromises that I fear will be made to long-held foreign policy positions in order to win over countries to the government's campaign to get a seat on the Security Council. We've seen it already in some of the votes on Israel that this government has adopted, and clearly they did it to try and win favour with the Arab world. Now, I am concerned about that kind of global limelight seeking. It's not in Australia's national interest to do that.
All right, let's just stick to a couple of the issues that came up this week. The G20 countries have reiterated their support to stimulus spending until global economies and the global economy shows that the recovery is more durable. You're very critical of stimulus spending, but would you concede that it has, while it's in place, it is saving tens of thousands of jobs in this country, as the government says?
But Helen, this is a great example. The G20 says stimulus spending must continue, but not for every country in the G20. Surely you tailor it to suit your economy. Now, we're not against stimulus spending. We, in fact, suggested that there should be a stimulus to the economy earlier this year, but our suggestion was that it be far smaller.
Sorry, when the stimulus first came up last year, you were arguing for tax cuts, not stimulus spending.
No,
but anyway, let's not digress.
Earlier this year, when
we already had stimulus spending.
I'm not talking about the cash flash in December. I'm talking about in February, when the government came up with its $42 billion stimulus package. We argued for a much smaller stimulus, much smaller and much more targeted. For example, we argued for a school building program, but not one that would have this kind of waste and mismanagement and blow out by $1.5 billion. We suggested something about $3 billion. A much more targeted school spending program would be appropriate. And I think we've been proven right. The level of debt that the government has now accumulated is unsustainable. But
so you don't concede that without stimulus spending continuing, tens of thousands of jobs are at risk?
Helen, the interest rate cuts, 4.25% interest rate cut was a massive stimulus. So monetary policy had a huge part to play. Also the fact that the Chinese economy was still growing and our commodity prices remained, our exports remained high. All these factors came into play. Our criticism of the government is that its stimulus package was far too large, the debt is far too high, it was not well targeted, and we're seeing massive levels of waste and mismanagement. Even today there's a front page story that $82 million of the cash splash was actually sent overseas to people residing overseas. Now, $82 million is a lot of money, but that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the waste and mismanagement in the stimulus program.
Well, one of the another of the decisions, the G20, they want to move to limit executive payments. Do you agree with your colleague Joe Hockey, who said executive pay is an issue for shareholders? So he doesn't want any governments to do anything.
Well, fundamentally, it is an issue for shareholders. Shareholders own the company. Shareholders should set the standards for those companies. And our concern is that the shareholders have not always taken the responsibility in doing so, particularly institutional shareholders. So there is already...
Well, they haven't been given the power to do so.
But there is already a mechanism in place for shareholders to be able to vote on executive salaries.
It doesn't have to be accepted, though.
I would be focusing on that side of it, rather than saying that the role of government is it to intervene in companies' affairs and set salaries.
So you don't think the government should do any legislation on this, along with the G20?
The Productivity Commission is coming out with a report this week, and of course we will look at that. But I think we should be careful what we wish for. If governments intervene in companies to set salaries and the like, I'm sure companies will find other ways to be internationally competitive, and that is the challenge. But fundamentally, it is an issue for shareholders, and I would like to see more focus on that area.
So you don't agree with President Obama either, who very strongly wants this issue dealt with by governments?
Well, I don't think that excessive salaries, whilst they were obvious in the Wall Street examples, I don't think they were the actual cause of the global financial crisis. They were a symptom of it.
But I think part of what Treasurer Swan and President Obama are saying is that they produced risky behaviour that then caused the financial crisis. But well, you would rather government stay out of that.
Well, I don't think there's a role for government, but let's have a look to see what the Productivity Commission suggests this week. We'll have a look at their proposal.
All right, just fairly quickly on climate change talks. It's now over to the coalition to really decide on your amendments and put them to the government. Can you reach those amendments, agree to them in the party room by the deadline of October 19?
Well, Helen, first, our position is that the government has given no credible reason why this legislation must be introduced in November rather than wait for the outcome of the Copenhagen conference in December. The Prime Minister said himself while overseas that the fact that he hasn't got legislation in place will not impede him arguing for reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, he went so far as to say it won't make any difference for President Obama either.
So do you think that strengthens your case?
Absolutely.
That you can delay even more and don't have to make the deadline?
We're talking about a couple of weeks. We're talking about the government trying to lock Australia into legislation in November, when in December the countries of the world, the major economies, the major emitters will be gathering in Copenhagen to talk about how they will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that will necessarily impact on Australia's scheme. If we're locked into a scheme in November and then Copenhagen comes up with a whole range of variables that weren't taken into account, the scheme will have to be changed.
All right, so are you actually saying that you're not going to come up with these amendments?
No, I didn't say that. Ian Macfarlane is working very hard on developing a set of amendments, and the reason we're doing that is the current scheme put forward by the government is flawed. It will cost jobs, it will send industries offshore, it will harm the Australian economy without reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. So we're working very hard with business and industry, as the government should have done, and we will have a set of amendments to put to the shadow cabinet and to the party room.
Will you be able to get it through your party room?
Well, we obviously haven't developed the amendments yet. We haven't taken it to shadow cabinet.
But it's a massive job, isn't it? Because you guys can't even decide whether to negotiate with the government or not. The Nationals, many of the Nationals don't want to do that.
No, that's not right. We've already put out 9 principles which we say are important areas that the government should focus on in putting forward a better scheme.
Do you think you'll be able to get to convince the Nationals to vote?
Well, one of the Nationals, Barnaby Joyce, said yesterday he'd be interested in seeing the amendments. So of course we will be debating this, we'll be arguing about it. It's not a simple question of saying, well, Mr Rudd's scheme or no scheme. Mr Rudd's scheme costs jobs. Everybody says that. The Greens disagree with Mr Rudd's scheme, the independent senators disagree with it, the Nationals, the Liberals, everybody says it's a bad scheme. Yet we are trying to come up with a way of making it better. But the government should be taking into account the very wise advice that they wait until Copenhagen to see what the rest of the world is doing.
All right.
The major emitters.
Will you be prepared to go to an early election, a double dissolution election?
We'll be prepared to go to an election whenever the Prime Minister chooses to call it.
Julie Bishop, we will leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Helen.
And you're watching Sunday Agenda. Another view of the G20 summit, this time from an independent bystander, coming up after this short break.
We're watching every move our leaders make 7 days a week. Sky News Agenda.
Welcome back to Sunday Agenda. Fariborz Moshirian is Professor of Finance with the Australian School of Business at the University of New South Wales. He's been keeping a very close eye on the G20 Pittsburgh Summit and is in an ideal position to assess its achievements at this crucial time for the world economy. And Professor joins me in the studio. Good morning and thanks for coming in.
Good morning.
Now, we've heard that the G20 will be the new driving force. It'll be the key decision-making body for global economic and financial issues, which means that Australia will have a seat at that very key table. Do you think this is a very positive outcome?
It is certainly very positive for Australia to be in a major international forum where China now is part of that, Japan is part of that, and living in the Asia-Pacific region, I think it's very important for Australia to have a strong voice in such major international forum.
So it is a positive outcome, but it sounds like you're sceptical about whether it's going to actually deliver on some of the promises that it makes.
Yes, I think this is the challenge of our generation. In other words, we do have now an advanced international forum moving from G8 to G20, and yet the G20 doesn't have an executive power to liaise and coordinate effectively with national governments. In other words, number of international agreements that we noted in Pittsburgh may not necessarily be implemented at national level. And I think this is the challenge of the G20 in the years to come.
So meaning that it does not have the executive power to override national governments if it comes to that?
Not only override, but also to in effect encourage or induce national policymakers to adopt those international agreements. For instance, they're talking about a framework for a strong, sustainable and balanced economic growth. Now, that implies that the US should change her economic policy, reduce massively her budget deficit, increase her private savings.
But isn't that what part of they were the aim of what they were doing in Pittsburgh was to try and do that, get the US starting to agree to be weaned off its massive deficits?
That is true, but then the US should rely on China's national policy, whether China is in a position to reduce her massive foreign reserves, rely less on trade and increase domestic consumption, and also change her foreign exchange policy. At the same time, they are relying on Europeans to become more flexible in their approach for investment. Question is, who is going to coordinate between the US, the EU and China?
Yeah, I'm laughing because when you put it like that, it sounds like who's going to give in first? I mean, none of they're major issues, major movements that those countries have to make.
That is the very challenge that we are facing in our generation, because most policies are adopted at national level, and yet number of issues that nations are facing are global in nature, such as financial issues, such as climate change, such as security. And so there's going to be an ongoing battle between national policies and international issues, where we are seeing at the present time a missing effective international institution which has capacity to deal effectively with national policymakers.
So I know you've likened this situation to the situation of state governments coming together. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yes, I mean, basically what we're seeing here is in the past assumed that you had only two premiers, one from New South Wales, one from Victoria, used to meet twice a year. Now we are seeing all state premiers are meeting twice a year in the absence of a federal government, a federal parliament, the federal court. Can these premiers, by getting together, ensure that the national interests of Australia as a whole is protected? And I think this is the very challenge we're facing at global level.
Do you think the G20 can effectively, or has been working effectively, to get the global economy moving again and get it out of recession, even though Australia wasn't technically in recession? Do you think the commitment to stimulus spending is working?
There is no question that we have learned our lessons during the Great Depression. We've learned that we need to coordinate, we need to be fast, when it comes to the difficult economic challenges, and the lessons of the Great Depression was fully implemented well in effect before the first G20 summit in Washington in November, where central banks worked together at international level, tried to provide liquidity. With the G20 summits in Washington and London, they have tried to coordinate the stimulus packages, and it worked. There is no question about it. But what will be the consequence of massive budget deficits around the world is a question to be seen probably in the years to come. We don't have an answer for it because we haven't experienced it during the Great Depression.
Do you think it's workable? One of the decisions they came to was that the G20 that has given the IMF the power to the ability to look at, check out each individual country's economic plans to get out of recession. Is that workable?
Well, in theory, you could say yes, but in practice, we know that the IMF doesn't have the executive power. There is no global ownership of the IMF. And I think this is the challenge we are facing. In other words, we have an international institution which doesn't have global ownership. People are not part of this process of creating the IMF, despite the fact that we are talking about now voting shares be divided between developed and developing countries.
All right. Are you also saying that the IMF, even if they get the ability to look at or check out a country's economic plan, they can't do anything to change it, even if they wanted to?
They will have difficulty in influencing domestic policy if a government is not willing to accommodate some of the international agreements.
Do you think the G20 can actually help boost global trade?
Well, this is one of the major challenges because they kept talking about free trade since the Washington summit November last year, and we have seen increase in number of protectionist measures since the Washington summit. Indeed, since the London summit, we have seen 100 new protectionist measures introduced by the G20 countries themselves. So on the one hand, you see fantastic statements about commitment to free trade and the Doha round that I hope we can conclude it by 2010, as they stated. Yet, in terms of delivery, so far we haven't been as effective as what we have stated.
So do you think it in fact makes a mockery of that idea that the G20 will decide on something globally and will be good for trade, but individually all these countries are doing their own thing and building protectionist walls in many cases?
That's it. That comes back to the same challenge we are facing. In other words, despite goodwill on the part of the G20 and its members, who wish to see a significant structural change in the global economy, the mechanical part of G20 is not strong enough to be able to deal with global issues when they don't have executive power to effectively coordinate with national governments.
Professor Fariborz Moshirian, we will leave it there. Thanks for joining us on Sunday Agenda.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all we have time for this morning. Remember, you can email us with your views at sundayagenda@skynews.com.au. If there's something you missed or want to see again, you can listen to Sunday Agenda whenever you like by downloading the show from our website. Just go to the podcasting link. I'm Helen Dalley. Thanks for watching Sunday Agenda. See you next time.